Brian, welcome to Podcastina.
Hey, Galina, thanks for having me.
Thanks for doing the show. Have you noticed any trends around depression these days?
I think one trend for sure, right? You think about social media, TikTok, Instagram, like these short videos, right? I do think that a lot of those videos are starting to be in the mental health sphere, if you will. And so a lot of people, especially teens and young kids, are watching more of those videos and getting messages earlier on saying, kind of pushing them in the direction of, hey, I have a diagnosis that I have not actually gotten from a doctor, right? I am depressed, I am anxious, rather than working with a real clinician to determine whether your nervousness or your sadness is actually a diagnosable disease. So I think it's a little scary, right? Because you have young kids that are on the devices and we don't, they're in their rooms or whatever. We don't really know what it is that's coming across their screens. And yet more and more people are reporting that they deal with these conditions. I guess the question is that accurate? As in, are more and more people actually dealing with these conditions, or are we self-reporting more? I'm starting to see that trend, and it's a little scary just from the standpoint of, if you tell yourself, hey, I have this disease or I have this condition, without a doctor echoing that back to you, who knows how that changes your mindset and therefore like the actions that you do or don't take in the world.
I agree with that too. And to an extent, I wonder because this podcast could be considered self help media, certainly certain episodes, such as this one where we're talking about mental health. What do you think is the relationship with people and their self-help media addiction almost? Because I think it's kind of like a spectrum, right? You take something like ADHD or autism, and maybe we have some qualifying behaviors, maybe we have some things that would put us quote unquote on the spectrum, but that doesn't mean it's diagnosable. Do you think it's kind of causing people to assume that they're clinically depressed when maybe they're not, like a confirmation bias?
I do think that that is happening to some degree. I'm not going to sit here and say that's all the cases for sure, right? I think there's a fine line. I guess if I look at the other side of the coin, is there's going to be a lot of people who are struggling with conditions who are too afraid to speak up, and the social media can actually help them, right? So it's not a black and white situation. There's some gray area as well. I guess how I look at it is thinking about somebody who is consuming a lot of this media. What is your intention and what are you optimizing for, right? So
Mm.
is your intention to say, hey, I want to go on, and a lot of this, which is difficult, is a lot of this happens on a subconscious level. But on a subconscious level, or if we can be honest with ourselves, we might want to ask, am I consuming all this media to somehow get validation of what I am feeling? Am I consuming all this media to um, not not necessarily breed a victim mindset or a victimhood mindset, right? But kind of like a woe is me kind of mindset. Or are you saying, hey, I legitimately deal with these different concerns and difficulties, and I turn to this media to improve my lot in life, right? I'd say that last option, like, I'm all for. There's a self-help industry, I'm part of it, you're part of it. So we're not trying to feed the negative aspects of it, but it's challenging because there are definitely rabbit holes that people can go down in ways that they can use this media that are not so helpful. So for me, I'm like, yes, you want to be honest with yourself. And I even need to be honest with myself at times, right? It's like, hey, when you're subscribed to a bunch of different podcasts and you're just burning through another episode and another episode, sometimes you have to take a step back and be honest and say, is this actually going to help me, or do I have something of an obsession here? Do I want to be validated in some fashion, or am I listening to that subsequent or next episode because I really think I'm going to get some new insight or unlock out of it? You just got to be careful with it because it can all tip pretty quickly where you get to the point of excess.
And I wonder how much it's exasperating the problem. Like, if you are depressed and you spend all of your time, whether or not it's on self help media specifically, just being on social media drives that compare and despair. And I think is like the antithesis of how our brains are actually supposed to work.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And again, I like to be not black and white because as you're alluding to, this subject is not black and white, right? It's like, I'm not telling anybody that they need to get off social media forever. Like, that's a part, these tools are part of our modern culture and they're there for a reason. And the reason is not all negative. At the same time, it's like, we need to make sure that we're constantly or, regularly stepping back and saying, am I using this in a positive fashion? Or am I doing that thing where I'm going online, I'm comparing and then despairing, right? I think a lot of the research that you see when you start to look into depression, it's like, I'm not trying to oversimplify it because depression is brutal. I've been there before. I've experienced that sort of thing, but it's very rare, if it pretty much never happens, that somebody finds their way through depression as a result of being on social media all the time. It's
Right.
typically, right, like getting back to the simple things in life, prioritizing getting some exercise, getting some sunlight, spending time with friends and family and people you love, kind of getting back to the simple nature of things. Sure, there's a lot of different ways that you can fall into depression and a lot of different kinds of depression as well. So I'm not trying to, gloss over all those things. I guess it's like sometimes getting back to the simple things, but also sometimes taking stock of our lives and being honest again and saying, okay, if I evaluate, my physical health, if I evaluate my psychological health, if I evaluate my social health, how are all those things doing? Am I happy with those areas of my life? Right? It's not to be too curt, but it's like, if you have no friends, you hate your job, and your dog just died, like, you probably should feel depressed, right? And so sometimes I guess I don't know what I want to say on the frequency, but there is definitely some amount of cases where it's like you are depressed because the circumstances in your life are not great. And so your body is reacting to those and saying, hey, we need to pause, we need to evaluate and make some changes, right? So that's where I'm getting at with this whole kind of ramble, is basically saying, like, you just often have to take that step back, be honest with yourself, do that evaluation, and, potentially make some changes that are going to help get you back on a better path.
Not that I want to encourage people to go out and attach themselves to a depression diagnosis or evaluation if they feel like they don't have that. But if someone has it, but they don't know, lack the awareness that that's the thing that they're going through, that that's maybe an area they need help with. How do you assess that you're depressed?
I guess it's a good question, right? Because it's almost like, if you don't know that you're depressed, you might not know that you have a problem, right? So if
Mhm.
what really ends up happening, right? Why depression becomes such a problem is it's hitting you across the face every day for the most part, right? And maybe you don't know at first, like, this is depression. You're just like, I'm sad, I'm going through a rough patch, whatever. But I think it kind of comes back to that idea of evaluating your life, right? Something is staring you in the face and saying, like, things are not quite right here. And so that message becomes the impetus to do some digging. If you're not necessarily getting that message, then, like, I'm not saying you're not dealing with depression, but at the same time, I think it shows that it's like less of an immediate problem in your face to be resolved. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are folks that are like in denial that they are in depression. And maybe, having conversations with close friends and loved ones can help reveal that sort of thing, where, like, like, just as an example, right? Somebody, you have conversations with somebody that is close with you or whatever, and you're always kind of on edge, or what's the right word? Like, kind of angry or mad or whatever. Sometimes somebody will say, hey, like, is everything okay? You don't seem like yourself as of late. You used to be cheerful and optimistic and outgoing and all that. I don't see that anymore, right? So if we can't find that, if we can't see that signal within ourselves, sometimes, the people that we interact with can be a mirror that reflects back to us. That's probably that's the best answer I got right now.
I actually really appreciate that answer because I was going to ask how important it is having like a second, a source of feedback, whether that's a therapist or a mentor or a trusted friend. Like, how important is that for us to have a reliable narrative on where we're at?
Yeah, I think it's huge. And one of the things that we had talked about in the pre-show, right, was this notion of evolutionary mismatch. The concept is basically like, we are, and I don't want to go too far because who knows, right? It's
No, go
like,
far.
uh, sure, okay. So, like, a lot of science would suggest, right, we're basically cavemen and cavewomen that are living in this wildly advanced, futuristic world, right? And so our brains are wired in certain fashions, and the environment around us has changed so fast that our brains kind of can't keep up in a lot of different circumstances. So if you think about what that might mean for depression, right, is like we were wired to have close relationships with people in our small tribe, in our small camp. And one of the reasons for that was if you had to go it alone in the wild, yeah, you were probably lunch meat pretty quick, as a result of how we lived and how we evolved, basically on the savannas of Africa, we were outside getting a lot of exercise, getting a lot of sunlight, eating real foods. And so if you think about now where we're at, it's like, okay, the world is very different from life on the savannah. A lot of us experience social isolation. We live in houses, which, they can be amazing and often are amazing, but maybe you live in a really small apartment and you're secluded from a lot of people, right? Maybe you don't have those social interactions that can provide that mirror to you. A lot of us eat foods that are processed and not healthy and stripped of nutrients and maybe even, damaging to our health, right? So I could go on and, like being sedentary, sitting down a lot, sitting in front of a desk all the time. Like we are just not living lives that are aligned with how our bodies and our brains were constructed. And so evolutionary psychologists would say that is one of the main ways that, for example, anxiety, for example, depression arises. And that's why we see so much more of it now than we did a long time ago. And so I say all of this to basically come back to your question of, how important is it to have those close social interactions? It's so important. And one of the biggest challenges is like, we just live in the world that we live in. Often we don't question it. And this isn't one of those like question everything, tear things down. It's more like we wake up, we go to work, we have our small apartment, we live by ourselves, whatever, because that's just the way that society pushes us in many different directions or in many ways. We don't always take that step back and say, am I really living in a way that aligns with how my brain and my body were constructed? For me, I think, and especially on the mental health front, the most important of those ways is still having that social interaction and those close knit bonds with loved ones, friends, peers, whatever, right? And so I think in a lot of ways, when we're not having those interactions and we're not feeling as though we're part of a group, our brains are firing like crazy, being like, I'm not safe, I'm not supported. I need to find safety as soon as possible. And so I like looking at all of these things through an evolutionary lens because I feel like it just makes so much sense to be like, I was supposed to live this way. I'm now living this way. I'm so far out of alignment that all sorts of wild conditions are coming about, and I'm experiencing different feelings and ailments and all that. When you get back to the simple ways that our brains and bodies were constructed and live in alignment with those, I just feel like, we experience more joy, more connectedness, less anguish, all that sort of thing. And it's a little cheesy, right? But it's like people will often say it's the small things in life. And if you think about those small things, right, you go back on the course of evolutionary history and you're like, those small things are good food, rest, exercise, sunlight, spending time with friends and family. I think we need to do ourselves a little favor and get more in line with those things more often.
Yeah, you kind of answered my next question, which was going to be what are small, really applicable, easy things that people can do in their day to day to get in alignment to kind of combat this evolutionary mismatch?
Yeah, for sure. And I think even though we did answer it a little bit, I think a nice way to keep the conversation going is to think about how stressful life is these days, right? There's endless commitments. We're all part of a bunch of different groups. We have jobs, we have bills to pay. We may have bosses that are breathing down our necks. We may have deadlines at work. We're stuck in traffic. We're basically bombarded than far more stressors than we are designed to. If you think about the way that the acute stress response evolved in the body, we go back to the environment of the savannas of Africa, and we say, it's funny because you can still watch National Geographic and see how for the most part how the stress response works is you see an animal that's out in the wild, they spot a predator, and all of a sudden they get real tense and they run away. And hopefully that animal survives. But shortly after they survive and run away, their franticness, right? The fact that they were running really fast and sweating and panting and all that, that calms back down and they're just back to homeostasis, right? Chewing on some grass next to a pond, whatever it may be. For us, we are still working with all that same hardware, right? In the sense that like we still have an acute stress response, and yet we don't face very many hungry predators that we can run from and then shut off, right? Turn that acute stress response off instead. And it's not to say like again, I try to work the balance of the stressors that we face today. A lot of them are stressful and scary, right? And it's not to make light of them. All I would say is they are not tigers, right? They're not lions. The problem is that we face a lot of ones that are off in the distance, ones that we can't run from or fight with, and ones that are really chronic. And so what ends up happening is that acute stress response, which was evolved to be adaptive and very helpful, is now maladaptive, right? Basically, it is running all the time, which means we're now experiencing a lot of fear and a lot of stress. And what does that mean in simple terms is we're now experiencing a lot of anxiety. And if we get enough of that, we might also experience depression or disassociation or any of the other follow on conditions, right? So, why I talk about this is to say it is more important now than ever, especially in this really stressful, always on world, to make sure that we're taking pauses and taking breaks and prioritizing our mental health by de stressing. I know that it sounds overly simplistic of like, hey, go do some meditation, go do some yoga. But when you really boil it down, like it kind of, we get back to the basics and we say that is actually living in alignment in some way with our brains and our bodies. And therefore, the more that we prioritize those things, the more we're going to turn off that acute stress response and live in a little bit more tranquility, which then reaps benefits for our mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you've ever read Gavin de Becker's The Gift of Fear, but it
I
like,
actually read that last month.
oh, no kidding. Wow, what a synchronicity. I bring it up because in it, he really harps on the idea that kind of primitive lizard brain piece that detects danger, the sense that we get that someone's staring at us when we don't even actually know that we've like consciously seen it. I think if people would just get more aligned with understanding that something is, even if it's just like not a physical threat, but an emotional threat, like the example of your boss is on your back a lot. And so you feel a threat to your livelihood because maybe you're going to get fired, whatever the example is, of just kind of being more in tune to the fact that it feels like a threat and that you're being put in fight or flight mode, and that you need to then get into your body and do something to like move that emotion through. Otherwise, it gets stuck. And I'm blanking on the name. My therapist at some point was like, put down the self-help books, but one of the self-help books that I read at some point, the author had spoken of the example sub-Saharan Africa, where like a zebra that gets chased by a lion gets away, doesn't go home and think about that lion chase for days on end, whereas we do. Like we will keep coming back to that, and it's almost like you're physically reliving it just by remembering it. Is there a way to like push that out, or kind of like do a palate cleanser so that a stressor that's over doesn't keep plaguing us?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think there's two things that I want to touch upon here, and if I get off track, just bring me back.
Sure.
The first is that what is so difficult about these stressors and the way, like modern stressors, and the ways that our brain works, right, is like our brains, the acute stress response, the fear centers of our brains are ancient and really primitive. And so when you're stressed out, right, and then you say, oh my goodness, why do I feel this way? I'm not supposed to feel that way. You create more stress and more fear in your body, right? And
Mm.
so what becomes so challenging about that is there's some stressor, and maybe it doesn't even make sense that it's stressing you out, but it is, right? For example, your brain is in high alert, and for some reason, there's a glass of water on your table and it's moving, and out of the corner of your eye, you see that glass moving, and it freaks you out. You're like, oh my goodness, is the room shaking? Am I losing my mind? Am I supposed to feel this way? Your brain, I know this sounds absurd, but it is running the same mechanisms that it would as if it were in front of a hungry tiger, right? So it
Mm-hmm.
is saying, it is making some leap of faith, some jump to say that water is actually the equivalent of a tiger. And obviously it's not, but your brain is still running that pattern. And so when it runs that pattern and all of a sudden you're like, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel so freaked out? This is bad. I'm not supposed to feel this way. You send a signal to your brain that says, oh, I'm actually right to continue sounding the alarms, right? When you instead learn the way that all of this hardware works and you say to yourself, okay, even though I'm really scared for seemingly no reason at all, I'm looking at a glass of water on my desk. That's actually how my brain works. And therefore, even though it is freaking out right now, everything is okay. I'm going to reassure myself. And by reassuring myself, I am then going to tell my acute stress response to eventually power down, right? So that is a really helpful reframe for folks. There was a second thing. So the original question, can you repeat the original question for me? Because I know I got a little off track.
Oh, it was, oh my gosh. I'm like, what was it? But just about like getting back into our bodies and not replaying us. Like, yes, there's chronic stressors, as you mentioned. There's things like, unfortunately, you have to work 5 days a week. It's a source of chronic stress. But like a specific incident happens. Let's say I get road rage for whatever reason, somebody cuts me off, I feel in danger. How do I actually stop ruminating on that? How do I stop replaying that back? Because I know in my logical brain that me replaying that back is actually causing me to relive the stress somatically over and over again, even though like I'm not continuing to get cut off in the car.
Perfect. Thank you. I knew we were onto something. I just
Hmm.
had forgotten a little bit. So more, I don't know, more anatomy, right? Is the difference between us and most of the animals on the plains of Africa. Um, Obviously, there are many different differences, but if we look at the brain, right, what differentiates humans from many other animals is the size of our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is foremost that allows us to think and plan and regulate and all those sorts of things. The prefrontal cortex is a gift and a curse, right? In the sense that, yes, you can plan and you can try to emotionally regulate yourself. You can, think critically and plot for the future and all those sorts of things that make us uniquely human. At the same time, we can also use the critical thinking parts of our brains to stew even further, right? And so
Hmm.
anatomically speaking, like why do we stew over somebody cutting us off in traffic, whereas a zebra doesn't? A good amount of it, even though the sources or the kinds of stressors are different than the ones that a zebra would encounter, a good amount of it is because our brains are different, right? We have that big prefrontal cortex that allows us to chew things over. That leads me into this concept of like the amygdala hijack, right? So within the emotional part of your brain, the limbic system, you've got the fear center of your brain, aka the amygdala, and I think we've talked about that already. But like basically, when under stressful circumstances, so that the term that we used already, the acute stress response will start firing, right? And what can happen is that acute stress response and the amygdala can basically send a message to our forebrains, to the prefrontal cortex, and say, this is really dangerous. You need to chew this over. And we can, we have the option. I'm not saying it's easy, but we have the option to say, thanks, amygdala. I'm good here. I'm not going to chew this over. We could also get hijacked by that amygdala and be like, oh, goodness, you are so right. Thank you, amygdala. I'm going to chew this over ad nauseum, right? And what ends up happening is we get sort of this synergy, if you will, where it's basically 1 + 1 = 3 instead of 2. So the amygdala is creating some response, and then the prefrontal cortex, our thinking brains, are having some other response. And it's almost like we're ping-ponging back and forth between the two. We get the fear response, and then we think to ourselves, oh goodness, I'm not supposed to feel this way, or that guy wasn't supposed to cut me off in traffic, or whatever. And then we send that message back to the fear center of our brain, and then that the amygdala is like, yeah, that's right, like we should be scared of this, we should chew this over. And you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So one of the most important skills in managing stress and anxiety is figuring out ways to essentially sever the tie between the, and not physically, right, just
Hmm.
just metaphorically, sever the tie between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. I call this thing, 1 + 1 = 3 between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. I call that the anxiety synergy. in the context of anxiety, in the sense that you can think and you can have fear. But when you're thinking fearfully, the fear gets worse, the thoughts get worse, the fear gets worse, so on and so forth. It's really hard when you are feeling acutely anxious to just all of a sudden say to yourself, hey, I'm done. I'm not going to think this thought anymore. I'm not going to feel anxious, right? Because your amygdala has hijacked you. It has said, hey, dude, I know you wanted to plan and plot and regulate and all that stuff, but we don't have time for that right now. Think these scary thoughts, turn them over, chew them over, that sort of thing. Two of the most readily accessible and I'm going to say easy, even though, when you're anxious, it's not that easy, right? Two of the most readily accessible ways to sever the tie between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So the first one would be to get moving, right? Move your body, go for a walk, go for a run, do some jumping jacks, do some push-ups. Essentially, right, you think about the acute stress response in the body. It is designed to get you moving in one way or another, to either run away from the thing that scares you or to fight with it. And so when you sit on your couch and you just stew on it, the neurotransmitters and the stress hormones that are coursing through your veins are just like, obviously they don't have their own personalities, but they're kind of like, hey, dude, we're giving you this fuel to run from this thing, and yet you're just sitting there. So you're not really telling us to turn off this mechanism anytime soon. When you instead go for a walk or go for a run in times of stress, you basically use those neurotransmitters and those stress hormones in a positive fashion that then sends a signal back to the brain that says like, okay, I've sort of appeased you. I've done what you've asked me to do. Therefore, maybe I'm misusing my pronouns here, but eventually the amygdala will say, hey, you did what I wanted you to do. Thank you. I'm gonna power down, or at least I'm gonna break this bond between, myself and the prefrontal cortex a little bit, which then allows us to go to some of the other strategies, some of the other stress relief tactics that we know and love and have, at our disposal. The difficulty, right, is when you are so anxious, just picking up one of those other strategies that isn't one of these simple ones that, essentially breaks the bond between these two brain structures, those are really hard to pull out, right? If you're freaking out, sure, like mantras as an example can be helpful, but when you are freaking out, the last thing on your mind is like, hey, I got to go get that mantra Brian told me about and recite that to myself and all that. Instead, right, it's an instinct, right? We just say, okay, get up off the couch, just move. You don't even have to think about it. Just when you're feeling that fear, get up and move your body. That is accessible to us, right? So that's a really helpful strategy, which again, once we get a little bit removed from that amygdala hijack, we're then able to slide our foot in the door and say, I feel a little bit better now. Let me reach into my toolkit, pull something else out. That was the first tactic that I wanted to cover. The second one is doing some deep breathing, right? So we've talked about the acute stress response, and that comes from the nervous system, right? The brain, the spinal cord, and all that. And so the acute stress response is a product of the sympathetic nervous system, which is also referred to as the fight or flight nervous system. It's designed to get us out of harm's way, right? The other side, so within the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system that runs without us really needing to think all that much about it, right? We have the sympathetic nervous system, and then we have the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is effectively the opposite of the sympathetic. It's the part of the autonomic nervous system that is designed to help us calm down a little bit. When we do some deep breathing, specifically when we get a deep exhale, the parasympathetic starts to come back online a little bit. So even if you're freaking out and you're in, an important meeting at work and you can't get up and walk around, you just sit there. Maybe you close your eyes for 5 seconds. You say, okay, I'm going to focus on my breath. I'm going to get that deep breath. I'm going to get that deep exhale. Try to activate my parasympathetic nervous system, which when you do that, you also activate, right? We talked about severing the bond between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. If you think about being in that high stress fight or flight state, there's really no time, right? If you're really in front of a lion, there is no time for you to be like, hey, Mr. Lion, like, I wonder what your favorite food is and what you did yesterday and who your friends are and all that, right? You got to get the heck out of there really quickly. What that means for us is when we are in high stress states, it's really hard to access that critical thinking that we sometimes need to then walk ourselves out of our stress and out of our anxiety. When we get that deep exhale and we bring the parasympathetic nervous system back online a little bit, those critical thinking skills come back to us as well. And then that's that metaphorical sliding of the foot through the door and saying, okay, my prefrontal cortex is working a little bit better right now. Let me go back into my toolkit. So the first thing that you want to do, right, is you want to essentially find a way to get your prefrontal cortex back online so then you can think a little bit more critically. This allows us then to make it so that we're not just those folks that are having those stressful interactions, right? Somebody cutting us off in traffic or us having an argument with a spouse and constantly stewing on it. We want to make sure that we detach a little bit from the amygdala and then work through some of the things that help us de-stress. When I say, right, like the prefrontal cortex is the gift in the curse,
Yeah.
it is the fact that we can augment our distress. We can also mitigate it, but it's up to us based on how we use these different tactics that I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you speak to maybe a couple other tactics to, as you put it, get out of your head?
For sure, I appreciate the plug. Just for folks who are listening, my mental health brand and the books that I've published, they're all called "Get Out of Your Head." So a lot of the tactics that I put forth are, kind of have that same name, right? So in the first book, I have this framework. It's pretty simple, but it's called the 10 Steps to Getting Out of Your Head. So it's really in line with all the stuff that we've been talking about thus far, right? So it's saying you are stressed out right now, you're anxious right now. How do you get out of your head and de-stress yourself? How do you walk away or back off from some of that anxiety? So funny enough, the first two steps are the ones that we've talked about thus far.
Mhm.
So we've got move your body and then we've got breathe. So if we talk about a few other ones, I did allude to mantras, so I'm not gonna that is a step in the list, I guess, to give folks something else to chew on. We'll talk about something else. Here's one that I like to talk about a lot, right? So this, for folks who are listening, just a little behind the curtains kind of information. I'm currently working on a rewrite of my first book. So the steps in the list, the numbers will get jumbled around. When I say step one is move your body, step two is breathe, that is in the latest edition, which has yet to come out. If the numbers when you read the book are different, that's totally fine. You didn't get a bad book or anything like that. But so currently, right? So and again, I know the numbers are kind of jumbled, but just going off the current version of the list, the current step two is called determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. And this goes back to the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, right? Is when you are freaking out and you haven't moved your body yet and you haven't gotten that deep exhale, it's really hard for you to say, oh, well, let me just rationalize that, this thing that I'm dealing with isn't that scary or anything like that, because you are in amygdala hijack. So make sure that you don't do this until you've gotten a little bit of that foot in the door that we talked about, right? You've moved your body, you've taken some deep breaths, you've calmed yourself down a tiny bit and brought, your critical thinking skills back online a little bit. Once you've done that, right? So I'll just restate the name of the step so that way it's familiar and we can talk about it a little bit. Step two, determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. So one of the difficulties, right, is with anxiety, we get attached to the anxiety itself and the symptoms associated with it, right? If we're super anxious, our heart is racing, our palms are sweating, we get tunnel vision, butterflies in our stomach, we can't think, all that sort of stuff, right? When you're in that state, it's very easy to attach to those symptoms and be like, I feel as though I am under immense stress right now. And on a subconscious level, you may say to yourself, if I'm feeling that way, then that's a product of the stressor that I'm dealing with. And the difficulty, right? So we talked about the fact that the brain and the hardware that we're working with and the acute stress response, all of those things are relatively primitive, right? So we're going to get oftentimes that same physiological response, whether we're dealing with something that is like an inconvenience or something that we sort of care about or something that really is a life or death threat. And this is not me saying that what you are dealing with is trivial, right? It's not meant to be that at all. Step two is meant to say, once you have calmed yourself down a little bit, you've given yourself the opportunity to detach from your symptoms and say, am I dealing with something that is really indicative of what I'm feeling internally, or have I attached to those symptoms and associated them with the stressor, right? So what it is able to say is, or I guess what you're able to say to yourself is, if anxiety, if the acute stress response are alarms, and if that alarm goes off, whether the stressor or the threat is a real life or death threat, or just like, kind of an inconvenience, or somebody cut us off in traffic, but we're actually fine, right? That alarm is still going to go off. So once we've gotten that step back, right, and said, okay, I'm feeling a little bit better now, let me now look critically at the thing that I am feeling stressed out over, right? So then you say to yourself, okay, alarm, are you indicating to me that this is a 4 alarm fire? Or are you indicating to me that I was making grilled cheese and I burned it and I'm just going to open the door and I'm fine, right? It sounds crazy, but we do this to ourselves all the time, and it's not our fault. This is the way that our brains are wired, right? They are wired to get us out of stress, and because they're primitive mechanisms, they work the same way, whether that stressor is really big or kind of big, or a little bit smaller, right? So it's important, when you're feeling that way, when you're feeling really anxious, take a step back and say, am I attaching too much to the symptoms, or are the symptoms really, is this really a life or death threat? Now, sometimes you're going to be under threats that are so huge and so massive that you don't know how to deal with them, right? That's probably 1 out of 1,000 or something like that. Those cases are harder to deal with because those are real, scary, live threats. But most of the time, we're going to be able to say to ourselves, okay, maybe this is scary. Maybe this is something that I care about. And yet, what's going to happen if the worst case scenario plays out, right? If I'm going to a job interview and I really want the job and I'm really nervous and my body is all worked up, what's going to happen? Let's say I fail. What happens then? Okay, I'm going to be disappointed. And then what happens then? Well, I'll be disappointed for a few weeks. And then what happens after that? Uh, I guess I'll apply to some new jobs and I'll kind of get over it, right? And then what happens then? Well, maybe I encounter the same stress and the same failure and that sort of thing. And then what happens? Eventually, I'll get the job that I want and I'll feel better. Okay, you've just talked yourself out of that.
That's a remarkable way to look at it, because you're zooming out, but I understand you probably have to do the initial steps first, that's not one that you can apply when you're highly activated.
That is, hit the nail on the head.
What's another one?
Okay, let me look through a little bit. Here's one that I talk about sometimes. They're all pretty simple. They're not meant to be like rocket science or anything like that. And part of the reason is, when you're stressed out, like, you don't have time to go come up with the quadratic equation or
You
anything
sure
like
as
that,
shit
right?
don't. Yeah.
You definitely don't. So step 10 is, remember this too shall pass. And what it allows you to do, right? It's not a term that I came up with. It's obviously um, it's all over the place. You see it on the internet all the time. But when you're stressed out, and I just want to remind folks, right? This is not me preaching. This is part of this is me reminding myself of these things, because I get stressed out and I get anxious too. When you're stressed out, when you're going through an anxiety attack, when you're going through a panic attack, I'm not saying those things are easy. Absolutely not. What I am saying is that if you're still here today and you're listening to this podcast and you've been through anxiety, you've been through panic, all those sorts of things, you got through all of those things, even if they were terrible, right? And so the next time that you're feeling anxious, the next time that you're going through one of those episodes, rather than sitting there and being like, this is so awful, and oh my goodness, I don't want to feel this way, oh, this is so bad, say to yourself, guess what? This might stink, but it's okay. I will be fine. I will live through this. This will pass and I'll get back to my life, right? And so much of anxiety and the way that we deal with it comes down to this reassurance. The more that you say to yourself, I shouldn't be dealing with this, I don't want to deal with this, this is awful, this is terrible, you are, in one way or another, you are resisting what you are experiencing. And I'm not trying to be new agey woo woo or anything like that, right? I'm just saying that when you resist, you create tension in the body. And the acute stress response is pretty much tension in the body, right? So you put tension on tension, you create even more tension, and that's not usually a good thing. When we instead step back and we say to ourselves, yes, there's all sorts of tension running through my body right now. I've got adrenaline, I've got cortisol, I've got noradrenaline, who knows what's flying through my bloodstream. At the same time, even though that's happening, if I can have the wherewithal to tell myself that, guess what? This is a normal part of life, a normal experience that happens in the body, or a normal phenomenon, right? Given the way that our brains and bodies are wired, then we can also say to ourselves, this may be a big deal right now. This may not be comfortable to experience, but I'm going to be okay. And what it's essentially, right? The term, I guess it's a more of a phrase that you see online sometimes, is what you resist persists. The less that we resist that thing, the less that it persists, the faster it goes away. So when we're in the middle of that anxiety and we say, yeah, it stinks, but it'll be gone, and you say to yourself, I know that this also is going to pass, you give yourself that reassurance, which honestly, sometimes in the moment, you can feel it. You get a little bit of a shift where you're like resisting, resisting, resisting. And then you say, hey, this still stinks, but guess what? It's going to go away. There's a shift in the mind that happens where you're like, oh, I got a sense of confidence. I got a sense of reassurance, or I know I've used that term a lot, but there's something saying to me right now, even though this is bad, it's not as bad as I need to make it out to be, because the faster that I tell myself it's going to go away, it usually will. Now, you have to believe that. You can't just be freaking out and being like, go away, go away, go away. You're just like, whatever, I'm going to deal with this chaos. I'm going to live through it. It's fine if it lasts a day, if it lasts a year, whatever. At some point, I'll get on the other side of it. When you say that to yourself, you basically take all of its power away, right? Because you're
Right.
like, I don't care what you're going to do to me. I'll live. I'll be fine. That is step 10, and it's something that honestly I use quite a bit, because when you're in that state, right, you're like, this is the worst thing ever. Oh, I feel so horrible. And then you're like, you know what? I've been here a million times before. And guess what? I lived through it. Everything's going to be fine.
I wanted to ask this because, at least from my vantage point, I feel like women are so comfortable talking about their anxiety, but for some reason, there's something about anxiety specifically versus depression where I don't hear necessarily men talking about it or being as open about it. Is that something that you've noticed, and how do we help them?
Yeah, I mean it's a huge problem. I've definitely noticed it. Um, it's challenging because, right? I think women women relate to each other on an emotional level a lot better than men do, right? So part of it is men don't talk about their feelings that much in general, let alone their anxiety or depression, right? So that's a difficulty. But there is also a bit of a social stigma, right? Some of it is evolutionary in the standpoint of from the standpoint of like, yeah, men they do want to look kind of tough. They do want to look as though they have it all together, because I hate to say it, right? But like, if you're constantly coming off as like a totally wimpy guy, that might not be a kind of guy that most women want to be with, right? So a lot of us are doing these things subconsciously out of mate selection, right? We're like, hey, the more that I look like I have my stuff together, maybe the more that people will like me. What I would say is, right, we really should be looking for a balance, right? And a balance in the sense that like, and it goes back to the last step as well, is like, you play the hand that you're dealt, and how you play it matters much more than the fact that you have it. What I mean by that is, like, we all experience stress and fear, right? Some of us experience more anxiety than others, some experience more depression than others. At the same time, these are parts of the human experience. How you then turn around and talk about that, or don't talk about it, right, is really what matters, right? If you have somebody who has understood their own condition, their anxiety, their depression, and speaks openly about it and is like, you know what, I deal with these things and I don't really care. I personally, right, and I'm not here to be a dating coach or anything like that, but I'm like, I think that is an attractive trait, right? To be like, I can communicate effectively about it. I'm not sure, I'm not hiding anything. It's just there. I'm not ashamed of it, right? It's difficult, it's frustrating, but who cares? I think we need more men to have that approach of like, and it is not me like casting judgment, right? It's really hard. I think for a lot of people, they're just trying to figure out how to survive through anxiety and depression in the first place. My goal with a lot of the content that I put out there is to help men, women too, but if you look at my brand, it's a little bit more masculine. Is to help men not only with their own anxiety, but then also and depression, the conversations around it. Right, I want to foster more of these conversations, make it a little bit more normal to talk about, right? Because it's like we're all so afraid that when we speak up, we're going to be judged. What I guess I'm getting at is when we don't judge ourselves, when we aren't embarrassed to talk about these things, then other people don't have that same sort of response. And I'm not saying that people wouldn't be empathetic to your cause or anything like that, but when you're like, this is just how it is, no big deal, even though it's frustrating at times, people resonate with that. You know, they're like, okay, like he kind of knows what he's dealing with. He's playing his hand as best as he can, right? And it comes back to that piece of in the last step where we were like, hey, even if you are experiencing anxiety and it's really difficult, the more that you're able to just take it at face value and not react further to it, the more that you send a message back to your brain that says like, okay, like he's got it kind of under control. He's got a grip on it, you know? And so we're going to power things down. I think for dudes who are reluctant to talk about these things, it's important to find, well, one, you got to find your own voice, right? You got to find a way to feel as though you are semi comfortable talking about these things. And then also, like, you got to find a few folks with whom you can have these conversations, right? You don't have to go out, you know, like stand up on your roof and scream to your entire neighborhood that you deal with these things. But it's like a lot of people, especially women, can tell, right? When men are dealing
Right.
with something on an emotional level and they're not able to express it if they don't want to talk about it, women can always pick that out. And, you know, my own experience, that a lot of women have said that to me as well, right? And so it's like, they probably want you to talk about it. They just don't want to be your therapist. They don't want you to cry about it all the time, right? So I think for us men, we need to find a way to just feel as though we are at peace with it, right? And then from there, it just becomes a normal conversation. And the great thing about it is, like, I will often say, and there's, you know, you'll see it on social media as well, this quote that you are only as sick as your secrets, right? The more that you put things into the light, the more that you talk about them, the less power and control they have over you. So it's like, let's say you're a nervous dater, if you're an anxious dater or whatever. Sure, it stinks. I've been there before. I would say that's a big part of my personality. But you get to a date, and instead of just being uptight all the time and having the person across the table from you being like, what's wrong with this person? You just show up and you say, hey, guess what? I'm nervous right now. This is how I am on first dates or second dates or even fifth dates, right? But it's something that I work with. I'm okay with it. And give me 10 minutes and I'll be totally fine. We'll have a great conversation. You know, like, you just kind of put it out there and diffuse it. I think that is a big piece of struggling with mental health, is figuring out how to talk about these things, or just being at peace with talking about them, getting them out into the light and diffusing them. I don't know if I answered the question specifically the way that you ask it, but that's how I think about it.
That's a good way of thinking about it, because you're right in that women definitely notice it and we can pick up on it, even if the man that we're with hasn't been able to pick up on it. But I feel like it's almost this thing, like there's this misconception that anxiety is like a weakness or that it's feminine somehow, when it's, as we've been talking about the entirety of the episode, it's an evolutionary thing that everybody's going through. It's just, especially like in the comedy community that I'm part of, like I hear men affiliate or relate to depression so much more, and then I see them being anxious as well. And I do think those two things go together. So I wanted to ask you, like, anxiety causing depression or depression causing the anxiety, is it like a chicken or the egg situation? Like, which one happens first? Which one happens second? Do they always go hand in hand?
That's another good question. You know, people will often say that these two conditions are like peas in a pod, right? In the sense that they go together a lot. If you look at like pharmacology, a lot of the drugs that we use to treat anxiety, we also use to treat depression, right? If you are dealing with either condition or both, like, you will most likely be put on an SSRI. And so what that really means is, like, the chemical pathway, the chemical signature is similar for both of these conditions. In more simple terms, right, is like, I like to say that what can happen is you can go from scared crapless, I try not to curse too much on these shows,
It's okay.
to utterly hopeless, right? So if you're scared all the time, you're like, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, you might reach a point where if you don't find a way to deal with that fear, you kind of fall into a state of learned helplessness, which is commonly associated with depression, right? So it can be like anxiety, 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 boom, depression. Have I heard of depression going the other way and leading to anxiety? I don't know, but I wouldn't rule it out for sure. What I can definitely say is it doesn't always have to be anxiety, 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 depression. It can be both at the same time. They are comorbid diseases. A lot of people who have anxiety also have depression and vice versa. Um, it's frustrating because it feels as though you're being punched in the face twice.
Right.
But like that's part of the battle. And I think that like the more that you work through either one, right? The silver lining is the better that you get with your anxiety, the better you get with your depression and vice versa.
Do you have any strong feelings about medications?
I don't. I guess my frame of things is I look at all of this from almost, this is going to sound crude, but like almost in an economic, like in terms of utility. So, like every strategy, every tactic that you come across uh, may benefit you in some capacity and may hurt you in some capacity, right? I'm like, let's get as much benefit as we can possibly get. The challenge is that each thing, that we're considering, whether it's exercise or CBT or mantras or medication, each thing affects different people in different ways. So you almost have to go through and test out a bunch of these different methodologies before you can say these are the right ones for me, these are the wrong ones for me. I look at medication as something that could be helpful and something that sometimes has side effects, right? So you have to figure out what works for you and what is right for you. The one thing that I will say about medication is, how do I want to put this like in a, without being too controversial, right? Is
Hmm.
um, anybody, like if you are really struggling and you're like, I don't know where to turn, medication can be a great resource, right? It's like if you're totally stuck, medication can give you that boost that you need. And it, for a lot of people, it is life saving. So I'm not here trying to diminish it in any regard. What I would say is, we all have feelings, right? And so going back to that analogy earlier of like, if you don't like your job, you don't like your friends, and your dog just died, and you wonder why you're depressed, it's like you probably should be depressed, unfortunately, in that situation, right? So what I would say is, if you also find yourself in that situation, and then you get on an SSRI, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to take these pills, and I feel better, but like I still don't like my job, I still don't like my friends, I still have this hole in my heart where that, my pet left. My take on medication is you need whatever help that you need, and if medication can help you, that is awesome. At the same time, you don't want to rest on your laurels and be like, I took these pills and I feel better, but I'm not doing anything to improve my actual life, right? So what can be really helpful for folks is taking medication and then having that medication get them to a point where they're like, you know what, I see things differently now. I'm willing to take action now. Whereas before the medication, I wasn't. And so, rounding this out, right, is you have to, it is a little exhausting, right? You sometimes have to try different medications and different doses and all that. But with any of these methodologies that we're talking about, you do have to take a critical eye and say to yourself, after a certain amount of time, is this thing helping me or is it harming me, right? And medication, like, again, it could go either way. I'm not a doctor, so I can't prescribe, I can't diagnose anything like that. But to folks who are listening, like if you're interested, have a conversation with your doctor, see if it's helpful. At the same time, don't abandon the other things that are available to you. Right? It's like just because you're on medication and exercise can be equally effective in the treatment of anxiety and depression doesn't mean you should go with one or the other. Continue to try out different things, see what works best for you, and come up with essentially. Uh, Going back to the toolkit idea, come up with the toolkit that works best for you and is just generally best for your mental health.
Amazing. Well, Brian Sachetta, if people want to work with you and learn more about the literature you've put out, how do they find you?
Thank you. I appreciate that. My website is getoutofyourhead.com. No dashes, no spaces in that. You could find me on Instagram as well. The handle is getoutofyourhead as well. No dashes, no spaces. Please drop me a message. I love to hear from folks. I love to, just try to point folks in the right direction, whether it's with me or somebody else, just get you the help and the resources that you need. So
Amazing. Thank you so much for doing the show.
thanks, Galina. I appreciate it.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye.